Meghan Markle's shocking humiliation in Geneva finally proves that she has just gone mad. I mean, this was the moment, Nancy Sidley pointed it out, this was the moment, the major defeat on her face when she realised that no one had bothered to show up for what was a catastrophic speech, a hypocritical speech, a speech which blows out of the water every single thing that she has argued in terms of her brand.
Meghan Markle arrived in Geneva with a clear mission: speak about children's online safety at a major World Health Organization event. But almost instantly, the conversation spun in a completely different direction. Instead of headlines focusing on the cause itself, attention shifted toward Meghan, the optics, the reactions, and the growing questions that now seem to follow nearly every public appearance she makes. And that sudden shift said a lot more than people first realized. The gap between what was supposed to happen and what actually unfolded exposed a much bigger issue quietly building around her public image. This was not some random one-off moment either. Over the past year, the same pattern has kept appearing again and again. A new launch gets announced, a polished appearance is planned, a carefully crafted message is prepared, yet somehow the public conversation drifts somewhere else entirely. But Geneva felt different, bigger, sharper, harder to ignore. The disconnect between intention and reality became impossible to miss because everything unraveled so fast and so publicly. What should have been a serious humanitarian moment suddenly turned into a storm of conflicting reactions, awkward headlines, and non-stop online debate. And the most surprising part? The problems did not come from one single controversy. They stacked on top of each other like dominoes falling in real time. That is what made this week so chaotic.
Prince William's jaw pointed out she was assigned to a bus stop. Look at that. Look at in the red circle. So actually, the woman who everyone's saying is there to watch was actually just trying to get home. Meghan's mole pointed out that even the Sussex squaddies couldn't be bothered to go to Geneva to support Meghan Markle, and as J.E. May quite rightly added, take away the staff and media required to be there for work and you'll be left with the flagpole. And of course, this does raise a really interesting point. As Resting Dollface said,
3 completely separate issues, each manageable on their own, started feeding into each other until the entire narrative spun out of control. One headline sparked another. One criticism opened the door for the next. And before long, the original purpose of the event was almost lost in the noise. The deeper you look at Geneva, the more you start noticing how every thread connected behind the scenes. The event itself centered on the World Health Organization's discussions surrounding children's digital safety. Meghan appeared beside WHO Director General Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus near Geneva's famous Broken Chair Monument, the massive sculpture standing outside the United Nations complex. It was supposed to project seriousness, compassion, and global leadership. Instead, it became the backdrop for a week filled with tension, scrutiny, and questions nobody expected to dominate the conversation so quickly. Meghan stepped onto the stage delivering a serious warning about the dangers growing inside the digital world. She spoke about harmful algorithms, addictive platform designs, artificial intelligence, and the growing pressure on governments and tech companies to finally create safer online spaces for children. Her message was clear: stronger protections were needed before things spiral even further out of control. She compared unchecked digital products to physical products that would never legally reach the public without safety testing first. And that comparison instantly grabbed attention because it pointed straight at one uncomfortable question many parents have already been asking behind closed doors. Why are tech companies allowed to experiment on people in real time with almost no accountability?
So why does Meghan Markle need security? There's a street with cars behind her, no crowds, people walking by, not caring. Nobody cares about what Meghan Markle had to say. She posts her own kids online. And New York Vicky, I think, really got the mood of this one right by suggesting that Meghan Markle is the antithesis of the icon that she thinks she is. She is the grandiose narcissist whose displays of self-worship are now and always have been farcical. And she zoomed in on the faces of those watching.
She also went deeper into how algorithms are specifically designed to maximize engagement, even when that engagement may cause emotional harm, unhealthy behavior, or dangerous online environments for younger users. Meghan pushed for international cooperation and tougher standards that could force powerful technology companies to answer for systems critics believe have gone unchecked for far too long. On paper, this looked like the exact type of role Meghan has been trying to establish since stepping away from royal life: global, serious, policy-focused, and tied to an issue that reaches across politics, class, and borders. The Archewell Foundation has spent years trying to build that kind of institutional credibility, presenting Meghan and Harry not as celebrities searching for attention, but as advocates working inside the world of international child welfare and public policy. And Geneva was supposed to prove that transformation had finally become real. Everything about the event appeared carefully designed to reinforce that image: the World Health Organization partnership, the Geneva backdrop, the United Nations setting, the subject matter itself. It was polished, strategic, and meant to project authority on a global scale.
A fan of Meghan's even said she went and greeted everyone who came to watch, which was like 10 people. In a serious international city like Geneva, this flop lays bare how people care about Meghan and her nonsense, which is undermined by her decision to exploit her own children on social media for likes and engagement. And the timing of this, of course, could not be more mortifying when we compare Meghan's crowds to Catherine's crowds in Italy while I was away last week, and as Meghan's mole put it,
For a moment, it looked like the message, the setting, and the branding were all perfectly aligned. But then the internet did what the internet always does. It locked onto something completely different. Within hours of clips spreading online, the speech itself started fading into the background. Suddenly, 3 separate talking points exploded across social media, and none of them had much to do with children's digital safety anymore. The first thing critics zeroed in on was the crowd, or more specifically, what many online immediately claimed was the lack of one. But as the story kept spreading, the reality turned out to be far more complicated than the viral version people were rushing to believe. As photos and videos from the Geneva event started flooding social media, people immediately began studying every little detail. Viewers zoomed in on the background, scanned the crowd, and started asking uncomfortable questions. In several clips, pedestrians could be seen casually walking past while Meghan delivered her speech. Not stopping, not gathering, not even glancing over for more than a second. People kept moving through the area like it was just another normal afternoon in the city. Cars rolled by. Tourists wandered around taking photos. Some people appeared to be listening nearby, but critics quickly argued many of them were likely connected to the event itself. Staff members, security teams, journalists, WHO representatives, and organizers already scheduled to be there. Meanwhile, the massive broken chair monument, towering near the United Nations complex, seemed to attract more spontaneous attention from tourists than the actual speech happening only a short distance away. That detail exploded online almost instantly. Screenshots of open spaces around the area started circulating within minutes. Clips were paused, zoomed in, replayed frame by frame, and dissected across social media like a full investigation. Online critics who had spent years questioning Meghan's real level of global influence suddenly treated the footage like proof supporting their argument. To them, the visuals told a very different story than the polished image the event was supposed to project. Now, whether those criticisms were fully fair is a separate debate entirely. Outdoor policy events are not concerts, and public attendance near a busy tourist landmark does not automatically measure success or failure. But on the internet, perception moves faster than context ever can. And once those images started spreading, the narrative attached to them moved at lightning speed. By the time explanations or clarifications appeared, the clips had already shaped public opinion for millions of viewers scrolling online. The timing made everything even worse because the comparisons arrived almost immediately.
One day, generations from now, children will look back at this era with absolute disbelief that adults once allowed digital spaces to exist without basic protections for young people. But let's do something now so that they will also look back and see that during this increasingly polarized time, where people can barely agree on basic facts, that beyond politics.
Just days earlier, Princess Catherine's appearances in Italy had generated the kind of massive public scenes people normally associate with senior working royals. Streets packed with supporters, crowds waiting for hours just to catch a glimpse, huge waves of public energy following every stop of the tour. The images coming out of Italy looked polished, powerful, and impossible to ignore. So when the Geneva footage appeared right afterward, social media did what it always does. It compared the two side by side. And in the harsh world of online optics, those comparisons created a brutal contrast. One set of images projected excitement, scale, and public fascination. The other triggered debates about visibility, influence, and whether Meghan's carefully crafted international rebrand was connecting with the public in the way her team had hoped. The contrast hit social media like a lightning strike, and people reacted fast. Within hours, users were placing the Geneva footage beside the images from Princess Catherine's Italy appearances, creating side-by-side comparisons that instantly took over the online conversation. Some people approached it carefully, pointing out that a policy discussion at an international organization is obviously not the same thing as a royal walkabout packed with supporters and cameras. But a huge number of people skipped those distinctions completely. Supporters of Catherine argued the comparison highlighted the enormous pull of the monarchy itself.
Or party lines, beyond demographics, incomes, or ideologies, beyond race or religion, we could all universally agree on one thing. We want our children to be safe. Let our children look back at this moment and let them feel proud of us, that we chose something better for them and for us all. Thank you.
Their point was simple. The royal institution creates a level of public fascination and attention that celebrity advocacy alone cannot easily recreate, no matter how serious the cause or how global the stage may look. Meanwhile, critics of Meghan claimed the Geneva footage exposed something Prince Harry had once resisted admitting publicly: that much of the intense attention surrounding the couple during their royal years came from the institution connected to them, not necessarily from personal star power alone. According to that argument, once the royal structure disappears, the automatic crowds, excitement, and media energy do not always follow behind. Now, whether that argument is fully fair is still heavily debated. The events had completely different purposes, completely different audiences, and completely different dynamics surrounding them. Comparing a humanitarian policy speech to a major royal public appearance is not exactly equal. But social media rarely slows down long enough to care about nuance. What mattered was that the visuals were dramatic, easy to compare, and perfectly matched narratives people already wanted to believe. That is why the conversation exploded so quickly and stayed alive for days. The actual content of Meghan's speech, the warnings about digital safety and online harm, started getting buried underneath debates about influence, popularity, and public attention.
Her face as she realizes nobody's there for me, but they were all there for Catherine. And do you remember when Harry used to say the reason that the royal family was so threatened by Ms. Markle was because of the way she pulled the crowds? Now, of course, there is a reason why this speech was so disgusting. And I'm going to get into the details of it, by the way, because she is using the grieving parents again of young people who have taken their own lives, while at the same time doing the exact thing she claims has led.
Then came the second issue. And this one became even harder for critics and supporters to argue away. Before arriving in Geneva, Meghan posted a photo to Instagram. At first glance, the image seemed warm, relaxed, and carefully personal. She appeared to be getting ready in what looked like a dressing area before the event. Near her feet was her young daughter, Lilibet, captured in what Meghan described as a mama's little helper moment. The post carried the polished but casual tone celebrity audiences recognize instantly: soft family branding mixed with behind-the-scenes access. And almost immediately, people started zooming in again. Supporters viewed the photo as harmless and relatable. the kind of personal content many public figures share to balance serious public work with family life. But critics saw something else entirely. They questioned the timing, the presentation, and whether blending a child-focused humanitarian appearance with personal family imagery risked distracting from the actual issues she had traveled to discuss in the first place. Within hours, the Instagram post became its own separate online storm, adding another layer of scrutiny to a week that was already spinning in unpredictable directions. But once the photo hit the internet, people did not just glance at it and move on. They analyzed every inch of it like detectives. Viewers quickly noticed the carefully arranged details sitting in the background. Hanging clearly in the frame were the exact clothes Meghan would later wear at the Geneva event. The blazer, the shoes, the polished outfit already prepared and positioned perfectly for the camera. That is when the criticism started building fast. Critics argued the image did not feel spontaneous at all. To them, it looked highly staged, almost like a carefully designed lifestyle shot released ahead of a major international appearance. And because her daughter appeared in the frame, many people claimed the emotional warmth of the family moment also functioned as part of the branding strategy surrounding the event itself. Now, nobody outside Meghan's circle can truly know what the intention behind the photo was. Social media often blurs the line between personal moments and public image management. But what nobody could ignore was the timing. The image was shared with millions of followers only hours before Meghan stood on a global stage speaking about protecting children from the dangers of online exposure. And that is where the conversation suddenly became much more uncomfortable.
You know what she's doing there, right? She's talking about her own trolling, because that's what this is all about, mark my words. She wants a censored internet. Dr. Tedros was despicable when it came to censorship of big tech platforms during COVID, trying to shut down people like me telling the truth. And that is what Meghan wants. It is actually gross that she is using grieving parents in this way. But I can't take a word that she says seriously about children.
At the World Health Organization event, Meghan delivered an emotional message about the risks children face online. Algorithmic exploitation, digital manipulation, addictive platforms, and the long-term harm that can come from exposing young people to massive online audiences without meaningful protection. She spoke about the responsibility adults have to create safer digital environments instead of simply benefiting from children's visibility online. But while that speech was unfolding, the photo of her young daughter remained live on her Instagram page, circulating across social media, gathering millions of views, likes, reposts, and reactions. Critics did not have to stretch the argument very far. The contradiction was already sitting in public view. The same public figure warning about the dangers of online exposure for children had shared an image of her own 4-year-old child to an account followed by millions of people. And she had done it on the exact morning she planned to deliver that message. For critics, the optics could not have been worse. The issue was no longer about fashion, crowd size, or royal comparisons. It became about consistency. Journalist Tom Sykes pushed the debate even further by framing the question directly. His argument was not centered on popularity or palace drama. Instead, he focused on the logic behind Meghan's public position itself. A 4-year-old child, he argued, cannot fully understand what social media is. A child that young cannot meaningfully consent to having their image distributed across global platforms where millions of strangers can view, share, and discuss it endlessly. And once that question entered the conversation, the entire Geneva narrative became even harder for Meghan's team to control. Critics also pointed out something else that made the debate even more complicated. They argued that partially hiding a child's face online does not automatically create real privacy. In some cases, showing only part of a child, the side of a face, a blurred angle, or a figure placed at the edge of a frame, can actually increase curiosity because people start zooming in, speculating, and searching for more. And that detail mattered because these were not brand new arguments invented overnight by random online critics. They were ideas Harry and Meghan themselves had spoken about publicly for years while criticizing media coverage involving their children. The same logic they had previously used against press intrusion was now being turned back toward Meghan's own social media choices. That is where the situation started becoming much harder to manage. Normally, Criticism from royal commentators or longtime skeptics can be dismissed by supporters as predictable hostility. Public figures deal with that all the time. But this reaction was different because some of the criticism came from people who had actually supported Meghan's broader message about children's privacy online. They had listened to her arguments seriously, agreed with many of them, and then simply applied those same standards consistently to the Instagram post she shared herself. And that kind of criticism lands differently. It is much harder to brush aside because it is not fueled by obvious personal dislike or royal drama. It is rooted in the exact principles Meghan publicly promotes. When critics start using your own words, your own reasoning, and your own public positions to challenge your behavior, the debate becomes far more uncomfortable. Defending yourself suddenly risks weakening the very arguments you were trying to champion in the first place. The irony surrounding the entire Geneva situation became impossible to ignore. A speech focused on protecting children from harmful online exposure was now being overshadowed by nonstop debates about an Instagram photo involving a child posted to millions of followers only hours earlier. And what made the controversy spread so aggressively was how visible the contradiction appeared without anyone needing to heavily exaggerate it. People could see the tension for themselves. That visibility became one of the biggest problems for Meghan's team because the story practically explained itself online. No dramatic editing was needed, no complicated conspiracy theories were required. The images, the timing, and the messaging were already colliding publicly in real time. And just when the conversation seemed chaotic enough already, a third moment suddenly entered the spotlight. One so small it normally would have disappeared unnoticed in almost any other setting. But this time, people caught it immediately. It happened in just a few seconds near the end of the speech, a brief gesture, subtle but awkward enough to trigger another wave of online analysis, adding even more pressure to a week that already felt completely out of control. As Meghan reached the emotional ending of her speech, the atmosphere suddenly shifted again. She spoke directly to leaders, parents, and technology companies, urging them to make decisions future generations would one day look back on with gratitude. It was clearly designed to be the powerful closing moment of the event, serious, emotional, and focused on protecting children in the digital age. Then, in a split second, cameras caught a tiny movement. Meghan briefly touched her nose. That was it. A completely ordinary gesture most people would never even notice in everyday life. But this is Meghan Markle in 2026. Where every public appearance now unfolds under a microscope online. Within hours, clips of the moment spread across every major social platform. People slowed the footage down, zoomed in, replayed the final seconds repeatedly, and started building entire discussions around what the gesture supposedly meant. Some viewers claimed she looked emotional. Others suggested she appeared nervous under pressure. A few tried to speculate about completely different explanations. But the reality is simple. Nobody watching a few seconds of video could possibly know what the gesture meant, if it meant anything at all. And that uncertainty is exactly why the clip exploded online. The most likely explanation was also the least dramatic one. People touch their faces constantly without thinking about it, especially during stressful public moments under bright lights and non-stop cameras. In another setting, the gesture would have disappeared instantly and been forgotten within minutes. But Geneva was no longer operating in a normal context. By that point, the attendance debate was already dominating social media. The Instagram controversy involving her daughter was still gaining traction. Comparisons with Princess Catherine were spreading everywhere online. And now there was another clip for people to analyze, another tiny moment detached from the larger speech and transformed into its own separate conversation. In a strange way, that brief gesture became the perfect symbol of the entire Geneva appearance. Every single time attention seemed ready to return to the actual issue, children's online safety, something else interrupted the narrative. First it was the crowd discussion, then the Instagram post, then the royal comparisons, then the viral gesture. Each moment by itself might have been manageable for a public relations team to contain. But together, they created a perfect storm where the original purpose of the event almost disappeared completely beneath layers of online speculation, image analysis, and non-stop social media reactions. By the end of the week, the humanitarian message itself had become almost secondary to the chaos surrounding everything happening around it. And even after all the noise, the speech itself eventually came under its own wave of scrutiny once people slowed down and actually focused on what Meghan had said on stage. On a basic level, her message was structured, clear, and aligned with a very real, global conversation already happening across governments and policy circles. Countries around the world are actively debating how to regulate social media use for minors, and those discussions are not abstract anymore. They are already turning into law in some places. Concerns around screen addiction, cyberbullying, algorithm-driven manipulation, and the growing body of research on youth mental health are serious issues. These are not fringe talking points. They are central policy challenges, and her decision to highlight them placed her directly inside a wider international debate that continues to expand year by year. On that point, critics across the spectrum largely agree she was engaging with something real and important. But the disagreement began when people looked more closely at how far the framing went. Some listeners felt that parts of the speech moved beyond strict child protection and into broader, more complex territory. Language involving algorithmic control, platform accountability, and questions about how information flows should be managed in digital spaces. For some, that felt like a natural extension of protecting children from harmful online systems. After all, recommendation algorithms do not distinguish between adult and child users when amplifying content, and that overlap creates real policy challenges. For others, however, the framing raised different concerns. It started to sound less like narrow child safety policy, and more like a broader discussion about regulating what people can see, share, and access online. That shift, even if subtle, moves the conversation into a far more contested political space where agreement is much harder to assume and disagreement is much more entrenched. And that distinction matters more than it might seem at first glance. A focused discussion on protecting children from online harm tends to draw support from a wide and politically diverse audience. But once the language expands into broader content governance and platform control, the audience becomes far more divided, with sharply different views on where the line should be drawn between safety and freedom. Adding another layer to the debate was the involvement of the World Health Organization. While the WHO is globally respected for its work in disease prevention, healthcare systems, and vaccination programs, its role in digital content regulation is not clearly defined. That led some observers to question how deeply it is positioned to operate in this emerging policy space and whether its expertise fully matches the complexity of the subject being discussed. And that question quietly lingered in the background of the entire Geneva appearance, even as the week's louder controversies continued to dominate the public conversation. Some observers went even further, arguing that the association with the World Health Organization was being used to add institutional weight to a policy argument that might otherwise face more skepticism on its own. Others were more straightforward, simply questioning what formal authority the WHO actually holds in this specific area of digital regulation. These were not extreme or outlandish questions. They were measured, analytical, and based on how global institutions typically define their expertise. And while these points did not dominate the online storm, they quietly added another layer of complexity to the Geneva event. Because suddenly, the picture no longer looked like a simple, clean humanitarian moment. Instead, it began to resemble something more layered, more political, and far more open to interpretation than the original framing suggested. By the end of the week, one uncomfortable reality had become extremely difficult to avoid. The story Meghan intended to center was children's digital safety. The story the internet chose to amplify was Meghan Markle herself. And those two narratives did not just differ, they ran on completely separate tracks. For most of the week, they were not even speaking to each other. The actual cause she traveled to Geneva to highlight barely registered in the broader media cycle that followed. And that is where the real difficulty begins, because the issue is not just about one event or one speech. It is about how quickly attention shifts away from substance when competing narratives take over online. What makes this especially hard to manage is that the problems do not stay isolated. They reinforce each other. Responding to the crowd debate only keeps the images circulating longer. Addressing the Instagram post brings the contradiction back into focus. Commenting on the viral gesture gives the clip a second life in another news cycle. In practice, the usual tools of public communication, clarification, denial, explanation, often end up extending the lifespan of the very controversy they are meant to contain, which leaves very few effective options in the moment. The only real solution is slower and less visible: time, repetition, and sustained consistency between message and behavior over a long period. Only then do individual controversies begin to lose their weight and fade into context instead of dominating it. But that kind of resolution cannot be manufactured in a single appearance, or even a single week in Geneva. It requires a level of long-term alignment that is still being tested in real time. And that, more than any single clip or headline, may be the most accurate takeaway from the entire episode. Not a collapse in one moment, but a much larger structural challenge that no single speech was ever going to fully resolve. The deeper issue Geneva exposed is not just about one event going sideways. It is about a pattern that has been quietly building for some time, and it deserves to be stated clearly. Because the vague idea that Meghan generates controversy does not fully explain what is actually happening here. What is unfolding is more structural, more layered, and far more difficult to manage than a single viral moment or headline cycle. Right now, Meghan is operating across multiple public identities at the same time, and they are starting to collide in ways that become impossible to ignore when pressure spikes. Not because any one identity is inherently damaging on its own, but because the combination creates constant friction, and that friction shows up all at once in moments like Geneva. There is Meghan, the global humanitarian advocate, the version that appears at international forums, speaks at organizations like the World Health Organization, and delivers speeches about children's safety, digital responsibility, and global well-being. In this role, she is positioning herself as someone whose voice belongs inside serious policy conversations about technology, governance, and the protection of vulnerable groups. That version depends heavily on institutional credibility, consistency, and public trust. It only works if audiences accept the message without being distracted by competing narratives around the messenger. Then there is Meghan, the lifestyle and media brand figure. The carefully curated Instagram presence, the family-centered imagery, the fashion moments, the behind-the-scenes glimpses, and the broader commercial ecosystem that keeps the Sussex brand visible and financially active in a media environment that rewards constant engagement. That version requires openness and visibility. It depends on selective sharing of personal life moments, because relatability and aesthetic storytelling are part of the product itself. And then there is Meghan, the celebrity figure, the one shaped by years of public conflict, intense media coverage, and ongoing narrative battles. This is the version tied to the Oprah interview, the Netflix documentary, the memoir conversations, internal staff disputes, palace criticism, and the long-running Sussex versus institution storyline that continues to shadow nearly every appearance, whether it is relevant or not. Each of these identities functions differently. Each one is judged by different standards, and each one creates expectations that do not always align with the others. So when all three appear in the same time frame, humanitarian messaging, lifestyle branding, and high-conflict celebrity framing, they do not blend smoothly. Instead, they stack on top of each other, and the result is a public perception that becomes fragmented, reactive, and constantly pulled in competing directions. This overlapping identity is not something she fully chooses in a simple, controllable way. It is the environment she now operates in, shaped by years of visibility, coverage, and accumulated narrative weight. But even if it is not entirely self-created in real time, it still defines how almost everything she does is received, interpreted, and dissected the moment it enters public view. Those three versions of her public image exist at the same time, but they do not sit comfortably together. In fact, they increasingly clash in ways that become more visible whenever attention spikes. The humanitarian advocate role gets weakened when lifestyle-focused content becomes the dominant talking point. The lifestyle brand becomes harder to defend when placed directly next to serious policy messaging that some viewers feel pulls in a different direction. And both of those are constantly filtered through the celebrity controversy lens. a framing that reshapes even neutral events into extensions of an ongoing public narrative battle. That is why Geneva carried so much weight. It was supposed to be an example of clean positioning, a moment where the humanitarian identity could stand on its own without being overshadowed by Instagram debates, royal comparisons, or legacy media narratives. A controlled environment where the message would lead the conversation instead of being pulled aside by it. But the outcome suggested something more complicated. Without the Instagram discussion pulling attention away, without the personal scrutiny dominating timelines, and without years of accumulated controversy acting as the default interpretive filter, the event still did not stay centered on the cause in the way it was intended to. At least not fully. Not consistently. Not in a way that held long enough to define the week. And that points to a larger structural reality. The different parts of her public identity have not yet been separated in a way that allows any single one of them to operate without the others immediately reappearing in the same space. None of this, however, reduces the importance of the issue itself. Children's digital safety remains a serious and urgent policy concern that demands credible attention, sustained advocacy, and real-world solutions from governments and institutions. The turbulence surrounding this particular week does not change the legitimacy of that topic, nor does it automatically invalidate Meghan's decision to engage with it in a public, international forum. None of this automatically means Meghan cannot eventually shift how she is perceived or resolve some of these ongoing tensions. Public reputations are not fixed forever, they evolve. The relationship between a public figure and their audience can change significantly when there is a long stretch of consistent, credible behavior moving in one clear direction. History shows examples of well-known figures who have managed to rebuild trust and reframe their public identity after periods where contradictions dominated the narrative. But those shifts are never quick, and they are never accidental. They require time, repetition, and most importantly, sustained alignment between what is said and what is visibly done over a long period. A single high-profile event, no matter how carefully planned or globally visible, is never enough to reset a broader public perception. What actually matters is the accumulation of moments, dozens of appearances, decisions, and actions that all point in the same direction until the earlier contradictions begin to fade into the background. That kind of transformation is a long-term process. It cannot be manufactured in a week in Geneva or through one speech on an international stage. It depends on sustained consistency over time and on whether future appearances continue to reinforce or undermine the message being presented. And right now, the reality is that the system around her public identity has not yet stabilized into that level of consistency, which may be the most straightforward way to understand the Geneva week, not as a total failure, but as a revealing moment. A moment that showed how difficult it is for any single appearance to override a much larger, more complex public narrative that has been building for years. So the question now becomes even more interesting. Do you think Meghan Markle can eventually separate her humanitarian advocacy from the constant swirl of personal and media controversy that follows her into every appearance? Or has the pattern become so established that even carefully staged international events struggle to shift the conversation in any lasting way? If you have thoughts, drop them in the comments below. The discussion on this has been intense, and perspectives are all over the map. If you want to stay updated as this story continues to develop, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss the next part. A like really helps push this further so more people can weigh in and join the conversation. And this is far from over. There will be a sequel coming, and even more developments, angles, and layers of intrigue still to unpack as this story continues to evolve.